Welcome back to Chapter 3, Section 2, How to Change Direction. This is part of the Unlocking Change bookcast, and my name is Robinson Rowe. Thank you for joining us. In this section, we're going to dive deeper into the organisational frameworks of Beyond Budgeting, Viable System Model, Stratum Theory, and Leadership's Vertical Development. Now, these frameworks will guide us through the steps we need to take in order to change direction. Importantly, we're going to show how we can use these organisational frameworks to build out an example of a real-life organisation. Now, we're actually pretty excited about this last bit because when you look in all the business books, you can't actually find where anyone's actually built out a real-life organisation. They provide us with line diagrams, but that's about as far as it goes. Okay, let's get started. We're going to start with our traditional functional silo organisation. And what we'll do is we'll split out the frontline teams from sales to support. And we'll take one of those teams that's focusing on some market segment. It could be a geographic region, it could be an industry, it could be a group of customers by their size. Now, what we find here is that the managers of this team are kind of like our crew in the raft rowing down the river. They quickly discover it's better for them to all work together, regardless of what their management are telling them from above. So what they do is they actually start building out customer-aligned teams, kind of like the way of team topologies. In other words, they're creating positive deviance in order to better serve their customers. Now, it's not hard to imagine this happening because in most organisations, it's not what you know, it's who you know. People are reaching out across the functional silos in order to coordinate their activities. When the functional silos are grouped by the external market, there are natural forces that really strengthen their bonds and brings them together. But this doesn't change the management structure above them. Here we find the typical layers of general manager, vice president, executive vice president. And this sets up a division between our customer-aligned teams and our upper management. One way to look at this is customer-aligned teams are focused horizontally towards the external world. Meanwhile, upper management are focused vertically towards their own internal worlds. Now, Beyond Budgeting explains that upper management's top-down approach is based on two false assumptions. The first is that the future is predictable and plannable. The second is that people can't be trusted. Bjarte Bogsnes, the chairman of the Beyond Budgeting Roundtable, has a fantastic analogy to explain this disconnect. Here is Bjarte to explain that.
Important word performance. I want us to move into traffic because in traffic, when we are out driving, we would also like to experience good performance. And for me, that would be a safe and good flow. I simply hate traffic jams. And I have, by the way, never understood why it's called the rush hour. There's no rush at all. Those cars are standing dead still. But there is so much that I don't understand. But anyway, I think traffic authorities want the same, especially when there is crossing traffic. And this is something we often meet, put up by traffic authorities to make that happen. And this light has no sensors, okay? And two questions towards this way of managing. And the first one, the one who is in control here, that is the person who programmed this light. That is the manager here. And where would that person be as you sit there waiting? Well, somewhere else. I never checked, but I don't think there is anybody sitting inside that pole. And the information this programming would be based on would not be entirely fresh information. It would be some historical trends, some forecasts, but again, not entirely fresh information. Fortunately, there is an alternative, a very different way of managing with exactly the same purpose. We are talking about the roundabout. Same questions, very different answers. Because here, we as drivers make decisions about when to drive and when to stop. And the information we use to make these decisions, that is fresh, real-time, here and now information. So very different answers to the same questions. Could be interesting then to compare these two ways of managing. So let's do that. And I've got a few leading questions for you. Well, first of all, it's actually been proven scientifically that the roundabout is not just more efficient, but it is also safer, and lifetime cycle cost is actually lower. And of course, it's more efficient because here people have the authority to make a good decision based on fresh real-time information. But we also know that it's more challenging, more difficult to drive in a roundabout than to relate to a traffic light. It takes more competence from us. And going back to our organizations for a minute, everything that we need to leave behind of traditional management is in many ways much easier for everybody involved compared to what we need to move towards. This stuff is not necessarily easier, but it's so much better and also actually so much more fun, so much more engaging. This changes work for executives, for managers, for finance people, and for many, many others, actually for all employees. And I don't think you will find many employees in the companies that we have helped going beyond budgeting that want to go back once they have started. But it's not enough with fresh information and the authority to act on it. You also need a positive value set. If there is a value set among drivers waiting for that green light, which is about me first, I don't care about the rest, that mindset is normally not a big problem in front of that light, hopefully overruled by red. But in the roundabout, me first, don't care about the rest, can actually be a big problem, because here we are much more dependent on everybody involved sharing this positive wish or purpose of wanting this to flow well. We have to help each other. We have to interact with each other in a very different way than what we need to do in front of that light. Two other important words here. Trust is obviously one. In front of that light, we are not trusted. In the roundabout, we are. Transparency is also an important word. Not that important in front of the light, as long as you can see the color, but in the roundabout, you need to be able to see and understand the entire situation. The roundabout is a more self-regulating way of managing, and self-regulation is another important word here, because in today's business realities, we need more self-regulating management models.
I really love Bjarte Bogsnes' analogy of traffic lights versus roundabouts, and how he highlights that the person making the decision is somewhere else, using old data and not seeing what is happening right now. However, there is a bigger, often overlooked problem that occurs when frontline decisions are made by upper management, and that is scalability. We can use Bjarte's analogy to explain what we mean. When pushing frontline decisions up to a senior manager, such as travel approvals, local expenditures, pricing exceptions, etc., we only think of this decision as a once-off. We don't think through how these decisions build up to a large number, nor do we contemplate all the interactions between these decisions. Now, going back to our analogy, what we looked at was only one set of traffic lights, which we think is a no-brainer for the senior manager to handle. But what about the interactions of this one traffic light with the 4 traffic lights on the connecting roads? Or the interactions with the 12 traffic lights around those 4 traffic lights? What happens when we need to manage 16 traffic lights, 64 traffic lights, or a city's worth of traffic lights? We can see how the number of decisions and complexity ramps up exponentially. Our poor senior manager's head will explode trying to contemplate the variance in traffic flow, unforeseen accidents, and all the knock-on impacts. They quickly find out that traffic flow is not predictable and is not plannable. How many times at work we need to seek approvals from 1, 2, 3 levels of management above, especially when the original top-down targets are not being met and suddenly there's some expense freeze on. The unspoken message we receive is we cannot be trusted. Yet, as General Stanley McChrystal found, that when decisions were made at the front line, the quality improved even when their operations sped up. To achieve this, General McChrystal spoke of enabling constraints, which is echoed by Bjarte Bogsnes with the need for a positive value set, trust and transparency, and allowing to be self-regulating. In our organisations, how many times do we find this happening? Comparing this to roundabouts, comparing our traffic lights to roundabouts, as we go from one roundabout to 4 roundabouts to a city's worth of roundabouts, we don't have the bottleneck problem of a single decision point. We don't have layers of management to get through. We have distributed decision making with fresh, real-time, here and now information. And to finish, as Bjarte says, roundabouts are also safer. In a study on traffic lights versus roundabouts in the Swiss canton of Zurich, traffic light accidents were more than 4 times higher than roundabouts. Beyond Budgeting's traffic light versus roundabouts analogy helps us understand the disconnect between the top-down management with our customer-aligned team. As mentioned before, upper management are focused on their internal world, managing and controlling their internal teams. Meanwhile, our customer-aligned teams are focused on the external world, focused on their customers, their market. To show how this plays out with traditional budgeting, we split our management into their functional silos. Now, after much internal negotiation, haggling, arm wrestling over days, weeks, and even months, they receive their functional aligned annual budget. However, when this flows down to our customer aligned team, to give themselves the necessary flexibility, they pull all of their budgets into one big bucket. Our customer aligned management uses this to make the necessary changes to meet the demands of the market. For example, they might broaden people's roles. They might hire resources where they're needed, not where they were allocated. They'll make day-to-day decisions like supplies, travel, and field marketing. Now, when our upper management tries to reconcile this actual expenditure back to their hard-fought budgets, well, you can imagine their shock. Some find that they are winners, while others find they are losers. Well, at least that's how they see it. They don't say, great, we have a better outcome for the organisation. Instead, they feel like they have lost control. Actually, they really didn't have the control in the first place, but that's how they feel. But like we saw with Save the Children in Vietnam and General Stanley McChrystal in Iraq and my virtual team in Australia, our customer-aligned team is using their assumed autonomy and flexibility to implement positive deviance to achieve a better outcome. As Beyond Budgeting explains, in order to change in the right direction, we need to give our customer-aligned teams both increasing autonomy and flexibility, but balanced with an increasing need for strong values and a clear direction. This is like our roundabouts that needed a positive value set, trust and transparency in order to be self-regulating. Now, to stop upper management from completely freaking out, as we can imagine, from their perceived loss of control, Beyond Budgeting helps us bridge the gap between the traditional cost budget management process through to the required one for giving the customer-aligned teams their autonomy and flexibility. They do this with their stages of alternate operating cost mechanisms. The first alternate cost mechanism is burn rate guiding. That is, here is our total budget. We are free to make our own decisions, but we need to stay within the total number. Now, this is what our customer aligned management team actually did. But instead of worrying about what their managers were thinking, they had been given permission to get on with it. They felt supported. But here is the important change that this makes. Our customer aligned management team were now responsible for what and how they spent their budget. They had ownership, empowerment with accountability. The other thing is that our upper management can feel a little bit more in control by simply looking at the burn rate, not by trying to count every dollar, euro, pound, peso. Next, we move into the 3 relative KPIs. These allow us to see how are we going in the market. Often we think we're doing well, but relative to the market, we may be losing share. Or maybe we are growing, but not at our full potential. To start off, the first relative KPI is unit cost constraints. We can continue to spend as long as we're generating more revenue. Our costs of customer acquisition, deployment, and ongoing support need to balance with our revenue. By removing this budget's upper bound constraint, we start looking at ways to be even more successful. It is no longer about hitting a number, but how big can we make that number grow? We embrace continuous improvement with a new vigor. The next relative KPI is benchmark constraints. This is operating with financially balanced governance. Are our costs lower than our peers? How does our pricing compare to our peers? And is it aligned with the value of our offering? The final relative KPI is bottom line focus only. We can keep spending if our bottom line improves. This avoids the boom-bust cycle we see with Silicon Valley startups, where it is growth at all costs funded by more and more VC capital. But as the late Clayton Christensen commented, the focus needs to be on how fast can we get to profitability. The final step is monitoring only. Beyond Budgeting have found that the most advanced organizations have moved to no targets. Instead, they use monitoring only of actual cost trends and intervene only if needed. In addition to giving the frontline autonomy and flexibility, this also helps upper management focus on their actual role. They now can be looking out to see what is happening in their markets, not just trends in costs, but also trends in technology, disruptive competitors, changing customer preferences, potential new offerings and new markets. Instead of top-down management of the front line, they are now helping guide the front line in the best direction or directions. So what do we think? Are we ready to jump in? Well, maybe we might be ready to half jump in. As a safety net, let's keep the traditional cost budgets in place. At the same time, we'll implement something like OKRs, objectives, key results. And we'll use measures which align to Beyond Budgeting's relative KPIs and we will dutifully write them down in our QBR plans for the next quarter. Beyond Budgeting has found this doesn't work because the conflict between top-down budgets and these OKRs that we've developed still remains. As Beyond Budgeting says, when push comes to shove, the budget always wins. However, as per the rider-elephant path approach covered in section 1, when upper management actually removes top-down budgets, that is the path, the signal that it sends to the people, the riders, makes them take notice of this change, the elephant. Trying to half jump in also doesn't work with trying to make a whole organisation agile. As the viable systems model folks found, you can't make the whole organisation agile by doing the same things at a different scale. They call this naive scaling. You can't simply nail an agile approach on infrastructure which is structured and run in a different way based on different assumptions. Remember our management fallacies of believing that the future is predictable and plannable and that people cannot be trusted. Viable system model explains that we need different mechanisms between the layers. Beyond Budgeting agrees. What they say that traditional budgeting is probably the most fundamental barrier that there is to an agile transformation. And it's because the mindset behind the annual budget process, people can't be trusted, the future is predictable, well, these assumptions are the antithesis of agile. It doesn't get more unagile. Wouldn't it be great if upper management just simply adopted and implemented the recommendations by Beyond Budgeting? This would give our customer-aligned teams the autonomy and flexibility they need to reach their full potential. Instead, we hear organisations talk about we need to act like a startup, and they attempt what we just discussed, naive scaling. That is, they try to get management to work across functional silos. The problem with this is their systems and processes fall foul of Conway's law and operate vertically up and down the silo. So when they try to build joint QBRs or OKRs, they can't really do that. So they fall to the usual suspects. That is Excel and Word. So what we've actually done is we've increased bureaucracy, we've added meetings instead of becoming more agile. Now the Beyond Budgeting folks, what they have found some organisations do is what they call the umbrella approach. They shield the customer aligned team from the upper management. This is similar to what the viable systems model folks found, which is they call insulating agile. Put in a firewall to shield the customer aligned team from upper management. Now the problem with all these approaches is that they're not self-sustaining. If a new CEO comes in or if they miss the targets given to them by upper management, whether they're realistic or not, upper management's going to come busting through that protection to take control again. Now we're not saying don't do umbrella approach or firewall approach. We've got to do something. Just realize it needs to be very strong because there's powerful forces coming down from above, especially if you start missing numbers. FYI, we are saying don't do naive scaling. It will never work. All right. So if these are not the right practices we should be putting in place, what do we actually do with all these management layers? How do we actually get them to work together to support our customer aligned teams? How do we get them to adopt principles like Beyond Budgeting? Well, viable systems model folks, Hooverstadt, Burrows and Morledge wrote a great paper called Scaling with VSM, Scaling with Viable Systems Model. And this gives us the clues to how to change in the right direction. The first thing Hooverstadt, Burrows and Morledge say is that we need to challenge our mental models on organisations. We need to recognise that the enterprise level practices are not immutable. They are not non-negotiable. In other words, we can actually get rid of functional silos. When we do this, it'll also need a change in the mechanisms between the layers. A flow-on impact of this is that it'll stop those shared services teams developing their own sense of identity, pursuing their own interests rather than the organisation's. We don't need to name names, but we all know those departments when we go to get help and they always seem to be too busy. Then, when we have the viable systems model providing the scaling framework, aided by other models such as Beyond Budgeting, we can start to head in the right direction.